Gaudenzi. We'll be speaking from UNAM.
It's the National University in Mexico.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Please.
I think so. Maybe I can have this. Okay, so first of all, I want to express my gratitude for being able to talk here and for the organizers. My name is Nicola Gaudenzi. I'm a PhD student in Mexico in the National University. And in Mexico, history of science is a branch of philosophy of science. That's how it's organized. So this talk will be focused mostly on philosophy and less in the technical, mathematical, or physical part of the history. I'm generally concerned about the role that philosophy played during the development of modern physical theories, and in particular in quantum mechanics. And maybe because I'm trained as a philosopher, I chose a title that is a bit cryptic, so I'll need to tell you what is it that I want to do. Basically, I want to trace the implicit philosophical arguments behind the debate between Schrödinger and Heisenberg about whether wave mechanics or matrix mechanics, which one was better. So I want to link this debate with the philosophy that was present in the cultural context within the German community. So I guess in a way we can translate the title as something like, in the debate about wave and matrix mechanics, where Schrödinger, Bohr and Heisenberg debating Kant. That's in a way I claim that philosophical context in the German-speaking world was mainly a discussion about Kantian epistemology. So basically, I will link each one of these concepts, Anschaulichkeit, concept formation, and the role of language, to each one of these scientists. So Anschaulichkeit, I will discuss it when I talk about Schrödinger's wave mechanics. The concept formation when I talk about Bohr, and the role of language when I talk about Heisenberg. And this last part, the role of language, will be both a source of many difficulties, and maybe, perhaps, it helps solve a few things. So the first difficulty, very quickly, the historical theme is what happens just after where our colleagues from the Max Planck left it. After the Unmendung paper, Schrödinger reacts and publishes with a bang sound the wave mechanics paper, and he also proves in the last part of the papers the mathematical equivalence between the two formulations for the new quantum theory. And some months after, in 1927, Heisenberg reacts to Schrödinger's paper and publishes this paper über den anschaulichen Inhalt der Quantum, etc. And the first problem is that when you look for a translation of this paper to English, you find out that this term, anschaulichen, is translated in many different ways. In particular, in the place where I was, which is Physics Text Exchange, I don't know if you use it, but right there, just after talking about the paper, a user mentioned, I'm a German-speaking person, and I like to add that I find the translation actual content is a little debatable. This is the translation that the NASA holds in their servers. He says, it sounds harsher than anschaulichen Inhalt, which could be translated to the content which can actually be visualized, maybe as opposed to that which is formal but has not clear correspondence to something real. Now, the first problem, as I said, is a problem of translation, and I'm not a German speaker, so this is the point where I should have just leave this research and leave it to someone else. But then I discovered that this problem of what Anschaulichkeit means is not just a problem of translation. Even within a community of German speakers, they all understand this term in different ways. So it was a deeper problem than just a translation problem. So it encouraged me to try to find a meaning for this word, and that could be, in a way, the aim of this talk, to try to understand which possible meanings can we attach to this word, and to see if going back to the philosophical context of the time can help us render possible meanings for this word. So, let me see. The first possible interpretation of Anschaulichkeit, and this is associated with Schrödinger's defense of wave mechanics, is that a theory is better suited if it allows you to have some sort of mental picture of what's going on. And I don't want to talk too much about it because we've seen throughout the conference that this topic of having a mental, is it too loud?
All the others.
Ah, yeah, I hear the feedback, no?
I don't know if it's... No, it's not.
Better? No?
But maybe it's just because you moved so much up front. So
Now it'll be all right.
Okay.
Better? Yeah? Okay, so yeah, it seems like there's a general topic of wanting physical theories that allow us to produce mental pictures of what we're talking about, from Paschen and Frank or Darwin, or many people feel that this is how physics should be done. And in that way, Schrödinger's defense of wave mechanics, and what makes it initially so convincing, is that he claims that it allows us to retain part of these pictures in a better way than the abstract, formal way that Heisenberg showed in matrix mechanics. Now, the second problem with language, or the third, because the second is between Germans, they understand Anschaulich in different ways. And the third has to do with labels. To claim that Schrödinger is defending wave mechanics because he's closer to traditional or classic philosophy sort of shadows some of the details of what exactly he means by visualizable. And I think it's worthwhile to take a moment to review some of the details. So first, well, it's classic, yes, in the sense that the link between vision as a way of certainty and philosophy is as old as one can think. For example, words as I insist, this talk pays a lot of attention in the role of language. So, for example, evidence, which we use in experimental contexts, but also in theoretical ones, comes from Latin ex vidence, which is to sort of expose the visual aspect or something. And at the same time, this word comes from an Indo-European root, which is this, vide. And just to show you how much this root can covers our language. It also became oida in Greek, which became idea later. And there are some people that say that oyster comes from the same root, and oyster later becomes history. At the same time, it derives to oide, which is related to the form of things. So for example, an android, it's also linked with this same root. So this feeling that being able to visualize and being able to convince, it's very spread. Another example is the Spanish word demostración, which is the translation for a mathematical proof. And demostración comes from the word mostrare, which is literally to show. And mostrare also derives in monstruo, which is a monster, which was understood at the beginning as a positive thing. A monster was something that, by its own appearance, was able to produce marble in you. And I find it interesting, this Goya sketching. This is Goya himself drawing, and he falls asleep and starts dreaming of monsters. And here he writes, "The dream of reason produces monsters," as if to show that this idea that reason can, by itself and without empirical evidence, prove things, and so becoming monstrous. So the link between being able to form a mental picture and being convincing works in empirical evidence, like in evidencia, in the word evidence, but also in rationalist claims, such as the mathematical proof. In its origin, it has this link. Now, there are many people that discuss this. We have discussions about the role of perception in modern philosophy, such as Kant or Locke or Hume, but I want to jump right ahead to what I consider was the most sophisticated and established form of philosophy within the German community at the beginning of the 20th century, which is the works of Kant, and in particular the critique to the pure reason. And I'm not going to do any justice to Kant because it would be a subject on its own. I just want to establish three basic ideas he establishes. And the first one is that to understand anything, experience needs to be filtered through at least two things. This which he calls conditions of possibility for experience, which he equates to time and space, and pure concepts of understanding, which are categories like causality, possibility, and plurality. So for Kant, there is no understanding at all if your concepts were not filtered or categorized through space and time and these other categories. This is a necessity, and it's the same sort of necessity as the fact that 5 plus 7 has to be 12. This is what he will call transcendental demonstrations, and the details of it are very interesting. But the important thing is that he claims there are certain aspects of understanding that are absolutely required. And the conclusion of the critique is that we experience the world through these filters, so that the thing in itself, it's inaccessible to us. We always deal with our synthesis between these categories and the nominal. So we have access to what is experienced, but not to the thing in itself. Therefore, metaphysics cannot be a science, and in that way, he's making a critique of reason in the sense of saying that reason has limits. There are things that lie outside reason, and those things cannot be made a science. Okay, so we come to Schrödinger's interpretation of Anschaulichkeit. And he claims that in order to have a good theory, we must be able to visualize it. This is probably, and there have been studies about it, this is probably an idea he borrows from Boltzmann. Being from Austria, he was probably aware of the big debate between Mach and Boltzmann, and he agrees with Boltzmann that theories that produce actual understanding in the Kantian sense are theories which allow you to produce spatial and temporal images of it, because those were the conditions that Kant had set for any possible understanding. So for him, this is an important part. But at the same time, he's not convinced that being able to form these pictures, it's a sign that the entities you use or the concepts you use are real outside of your scheme of theoretical construction. So in a way, he shares Mach's anti-realism, but he doesn't agree with Mach in the fact that Mach claimed that science should only describe the world, and Schrödinger is interested in understanding the world. Understanding, again, I claim he's referring to the Kantian understanding. So many years later, he claimed Boltzmann's idea consisted in forming absolutely clear, almost naively clear, and detailed pictures, mainly in order to be quite sure of avoiding contradictory assumptions. Mach's ideal was the cautious synthesis of observational facts that can, if desired, be tracked back to the plain, crude sensual perceptions. He was most anxious not to contaminate this absolutely reliable timber with any other one of a more doubtful origin. But he claims, however, we decided for ourselves that these were just different methods of attack, that you could have your cake and eat it too, that you could have both ways. You could have the mental pictures, but not commit to the real existence of it. So in a way, his way of understanding visualizability is it's a bit more sophisticated than the pure empirical claim that if you see it, then it must be true. He was not so naive. Right after the wave mechanics appeared, this was very appealing, but it soon found many arguments against, which I will not just yet cover in detail. Now, the reaction was usually taken as one of the sources of inspiration for the Copenhagen community to come together and work against a common enemy. This position is very interesting because after the proof that the two mechanics were equivalent, scientists had to choose but could not rely either on evidence, empirical evidence, or mathematical arguments, because in both those areas, both formulations worked more or less equally well. So they had to go to philosophical arguments, and this gives us an opportunity to see how they were using this philosophy. Now, oh, okay, so it was usually thought that there was agreement between the Copenhagen interpretation, but now we've seen that within the community there were differences and debates. So I want to present what Bohr thought about this problem of Anschaulichkeit, to then be able to see what Heisenberg specifically said. When Bohr gives the famous common lecture in 27, he is mainly concerned about the fact that quantum mechanics seems irrational. It's a word that in the paper appears like 30 times, and he claims that we have a fundamental limitation in our classical physical ideas when applied to atomic phenomena. This topic of fundamental limitations of our classic physical ideas, it's the topic that Kant was concerned with. Why is it that there are certain things that escape our possibility to do science? In the common lecture paper, Bohr seems to be claiming that there is no escape to this limit, that the way in which we form concepts, which is a classical way, will never be able to form other types of concepts, and therefore we'll have to deal with the quantum strangeness of the microcosmos because it has these classical notions, and there is no escape to this. Now, in the time, other, mostly philosophers, read the a priori of Kant, these conditions, as evolutionary feats, as the type of tools that allowed us to create concepts that in turn allow us to live in this scale of reality. Some other readings were that a priori were actually psychological traits. But in Bohr's view, the way we form concepts is, or at least the way physicists form concepts, is the way that experimental work happens. It's through the movement of classical experimental apparatus and its correspondent effect that we slowly build up a concept of what's underlying this relationship. And since we cannot escape the classical nature of it, because our experimental apparatus are classical and our way of measuring is classical, then we will have to deal with the feeling that it's irrational. It's only a feeling due to this classical concept formation, but we can lessen the tension if instead of thinking in terms of one picture that explains all, we use two complementary pictures that give us the whole idea behind what's going on in the quantum world. So to make the distinction a little bit clear, when Boltzmann talked about temperature as the mean velocity of these tiny atoms, Schrödinger would say that this is a good explanation because you can make a mental model of these tiny balls bouncing each other, even if you didn't commit to the fact that they actually existed. You had a better theory of temperature just by the fact that you could picture it. Bohr would say that it is your best understanding of temperature because it was the only way to relate the microscopic phenomena with your classical concepts that you form playing football or whatever, with balls bouncing each other. So at least in my reading, in this Kantian reading, Bohr's complementary principle is, on the one hand, resignation to the fact that the way we form concepts is limited, and on the other way, it's the only solution that he finds could cover this gap between the phenomena and our explanation of it. Corner said of Bohr's concerns about this time, Bohr's principal concerns were of a kind which, since Kant, have been commonly described as transcendental, a fundamental concern with the necessary conditions for the possibility of experimental knowledge. So it seems that this recognition of the limits of knowledge is also a Kantian theme. Let me turn then to Heisenberg. And Heisenberg has a very strange solution to this question. He agrees with Schrödinger that science should aim for something more than pure description. Science should give us understanding. And he also agrees with Bohr that there are fundamental limits to our concepts. But he claims that the concepts we have and the limits imposed by them are not of a universal necessity, as Kant would have suggested, but rather are formed by the particular language we use to construct them. So for Heisenberg, it is perfectly possible that some new theory would change the way in which we speak about the world, and this change in turn shifts the way in which we form concepts, and in this new language we would find that things that before were unintuitive or not visualizable all of a sudden become more natural. For example, he claims that the picture, the classic Galilean thought experiment of, okay, you have a ball in the vacuum and it hits another ball and there's an elastic collision. He claims that was unconceivable before having a full-fledged language that allow you to relate what elastic collision, what vacuum, what spheric ball meant. And in the same way, he would claim that the virtue of statistical mechanics is not so much that it allows you to picture these balls bouncing, but it's that it gives you a full language with which you can form new concepts of what's underlying the phenomena that you experience. So when he opens the Anschaulichkeit paper, he says something which is at the beginning odd. He says, we believe we've gained Anschaulich, understanding of a physical theory, if in all simple cases we can grasp the experimental consequences qualitatively and see that the theory does not lead to any contradictions. Two things are remarkable of this opening. First is this qualitatively assessment, which is very difficult to clearly define. We could debate all day, oh no, this theory does have Anschaulich because qualitatively I find that it's good, and someone else wouldn't. So it's very strange. And then the only restriction he imposes on Anschaulichkeit is the fact that the theory does not lead to any contradictions. But in order to assess that a theory doesn't lead to any contradictions, you need to know that the theory is complete and that the whole theory, in the end, is not contradictory. This, I don't know, but I find very interesting, is very similar to the language that Hilbert would use when speaking about his program in mathematics. And being trained in mathematics by Hilbert, maybe there is some connection between this philosophy of mathematics and this view of physical theories. What we do know is that there is an initial positivist scheme in this paper where he's trying to give a theory between things that are only observable without paying much attention to the models behind it. Now, this definition of Anschaulich seems at the beginning a little bit unfair. It's like just saying, oh no, the word you're using, I understand it completely different, and in my understanding, my theory turns out to be better. What is interesting is that he will later, and this is a historiographical problem because most of these comments come from maybe 20 years later, and then we have to reconstruct back to see which parts of the paper were actually following these intuitions. But they're they become more sophisticated, but in principle it seems that Heisenberg had some of these ideas already in 27. And he will, after this paper, he will present in the Solvay Congress with Born, and they will conclude that they regard quantum mechanics as a complete theory for which the fundamental physical and mathematical hypotheses are no longer susceptible of modification. This point is for his particular philosophy very important because it's only in a complete theory that you can assess whether it's free of contradictions and therefore assess if it has anschaulich or it doesn't. So in his view, the meaning of a theoretical term can only be properly ascribed once you have a complete theory around it. Or put in other terms, the meaning of terms does not come from ostensive reference, but from the holist evaluation of the language it comes with. So he will claim that it is true that you need concepts, there are a prioris, but that these a prioris are changed historically with the change of language. And one interesting thing about this is that in a way I'm following Heisenberg's own scheme with the word anschaulich. What I'm claiming is that it's a word that its meaning can only be fully understood if we have a complete context in which we can say what it means. So this is just a quote saying the same. Space-time and causality remain for Heisenberg the conditions for the possibility of experience, but unlike Kant, they do not have transcendental universality and necessity. Rather, such concepts have arisen through the historical development of human language and turn out to have only limited range of applicability. So just to finish, the question I asked at the beginning, were they discussing in Kant? Well, at least in my reading of this debate, it seems that even though it was not always explicit, post-Kantian philosophy was definitely the cultural background where all this debate took place. And by acknowledging it, we do gain some insight about the meaning of their words in their papers. Now, none of them completely rejected Kant, but they were all convinced that it was no longer valid as it was originally conceived. And this is a topic which will be present in most of the intellectual work in Germany at the time, from philosophy of mathematics, logic positivism, theory of language, many things. So Kant was everywhere. They were not Kant deniers, they were Kant's reformers. And I want to end with this quote of Camilleri quoting Chevalier saying, by situating Heisenberg's thought against the background of post-Kantian philosophy in the German-speaking world, it becomes evident that many of the themes in which he was concerned in the 1920s and 1930s were consistent with the major issues of philosophical thought at the turn of the 20th century. I think that can be said for most of the theoretical physics work of the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have a question about your concept of, no, it's the concept of the way that you put the discussion. Until the very few last moments, you mentioned Kant, and at the end you moved to post-Kant. And I think it is important difference because Kant was, I don't think he was the most sophisticated philosophy suggested at the beginning of the 20th century. There was a lot of literature in the post-Kantian, and there was a lot of literature, other philosophical literature, and so I wonder how much. I wonder how much Kant is important directly. Of course, we cannot think of philosophy of the early 20th century without thinking of Kant, but as a direct connection. And what I'm more concerned from your talk is the way that you try to show us the connection. Because what you showed that you showed us correspondence. So there are things that we can read that fits Kant. Did you try to make the same the same kind of work with Hegel, with Plato, Aristotle, so I can add other philosophers? And I think in many of them, whatever we have question of epistemology, it perhaps fits. So this is not enough. I think what we need is to have the connections, and historians did find the connections, and they found connections of both to other philosophers, which were very influenced for Kant, talk with Kant, and so on and so forth. So I'm looking more on that, and other historians also looked on the very important tradition of philosophical thinking within physics. Or if you look at the physics textbooks and what physicists write in the more general things, the work of Terry Gold, for example, emphasized that, you find a lot of connection to philosophy. You mentioned Boltzmann, it's only one example.
I completely agree with I think there's three parts of your comment. The first is how much Kant is Kant by the beginning of the 20th century. And I think definitely it has changed a lot, and mostly it has changed in what is called the continental philosophy. Like most big narratives against Kant, like Hegel or I don't know, Schopenhauer, or there's definitely improvement and change, and Kant is not the Kant that wrote at the end of the 18th century. It's a completely different, and there are more sophisticated philosophers, no doubt, but I feel that Kant was the established philosophy, was the philosophy that you would study as an undergraduate, and in a way it permeated so much that you can understand why someone from Vienna, someone from Copenhagen, and Heisenberg himself, they were all well trained on Kantian theory. So definitely there are more, there are works after Kant, and philosophy has changed a lot, but I think I take Kant was the not the enemy, but the context in which debates would happen, in the same sense that classical mechanics develops as a reaction against some sort of Aristotelian worldview, although from Aristoteles to Galileo, obviously Aristoteles is not the same one. So I agree with you, but at the same time I think that what I called classic philosophy for a German in the period in analytic philosophy, I think it would be Kant. Of course, there are connections to, and this goes to the second part of the comment, to other philosophers, and I don't claim that Kant was the only one. On the contrary, I claim that the more we can link how they were thinking to what was happening in the realm of philosophy, the more clear the meaning of their choice of words would be. So I wouldn't commit to something like it was only Kant and we should only study Kant. And the third part, I don't remember. Textbooks and
The philosophy within the physics, like that kind of philosophical thinking of physics.
Mhm.
We have several more questions.
Yeah.
Do you want to respond to this last point?
Maybe I'll.
So, please.
Right, so you mentioned the Chevalier quote that's in Christian's book, and that, I don't know if you've looked at that paper, but Catherine Chevalier's paper, it's in the Fay and False volume on Bohr, is about Kantianism in just this way, and it talks about the tradition, the historical, philosophical tradition that it's steeped in. And I think she makes some really important points there, not just about Bohr, but she says that starting in 1927, which is the period in which Heisenberg is writing this paper, talk about symbol and Anschaulichkeit and all this becomes very important. And I think this coincides with your complaint at the beginning about the maybe poor translation of this paper. I mean, I think Wheeler and Zurich translate the title as physical content or something. But in this, I want to complain about calling Heisenberg a positivist in this sense, because when he's talking about internal consistency, it's not just logical, of course, your theory needs to match and explain the observable phenomena. But I think he's really doing something much more sophisticated in a Kantian way there, and which very likely was influenced by Bohr, and it's that term symbol. And it's namely that when we're dealing with unobservable phenomena like we are in quantum mechanics, we can no longer use pure intuition coupled with empirical data to get understanding, which is Kant's schema. Instead, we have pure intuition, but we don't have that empirical intuition. So instead, we must use symbols. And classical concepts are symbols. And so when we have consistency between the symbols and the analogy that those symbols give us to that which cannot be directly intuited, then, only then, can we get understanding. So I think there's a lot of subtlety going on in Heisenberg's paper, and I do think that even if it's not Kant, is maybe beside the point, they're using this well-established terminology to say something deeply philosophical.
But the complaint is that it's about giving him the label of positivist, no?
Yeah, well, I think that's just a little bit more strange. I think he's doing something more sophisticated than just...
That's what I feel with the problem of labels. If we say, oh, he was a positivist, then we don't make the exercise of, but what kind of positivism, or exactly how? And at least in the way I read it, it surprised me that he's making arguments from the physical side that later will appear in analytic philosophy as philosophical arguments, which will end up being serious threats to logical positivism. To think that the meaning of terms it's determined by the whole of language was precisely Quine's argument about against the division of logic positivism of analytic and synthetic. So it's very surprising that for me, and that's why I follow his scheme during the talk, for me this new view of the relationship between phenomena and concepts as mediated by language definitely goes beyond what logic positivism was thinking at the time. Because if, as Heisenberg thought, language changed historically, then there was no possibility of constructing one language which would verify your terms. No? So yeah, I would agree that it's poor to just leave it at thinking that he was just a positivist. No?
Okay, so that was a very interesting talk, and I think it's really interesting the way you bring Kant back into the story. And I disagree with the two previous speakers. That I like to get my Kant straight up. You know, like let's draw the veil of charity over German idealism, and like what how Bohr is reading this is also not so interesting. So I think you do the right thing, like giving this simple account of what the basic ideas are, and I think you're right to assume that this is permeating, like, the German society at the time. The one case where we have very carefully studied, like, what people's physicists, like, philosophical background is the case of Einstein, which I think fits very nicely with the sort of things that you're saying. So I was just like, Christoph and I were discussing this, and so I think it's to illustrate like how it's important to like bring this perspective back into the story. Let me just tell you how like reacting to Jora's talk this morning, right? So on the Kantian view, right, where basically you're using some conceptual scheme to like filter to construct like the phenomenal world and accepting that you don't know anything about the noumenal world except through that, right? The distinction that Jora was like pointing to in his talk about the difference between belief and like commitment, I mean, completely collapses, right? On a Kantian view, like there is nothing to believe beyond this, because like so if from the very fact that that this view of the old quantum theory like systematizes the knowledge that people are dealing with at the time, that is as real as it's going to get. Right, and so then these things change. So I think it's very interesting to bring that back into the picture, which is a sort of perspective that has been completely lost in standard Anglo-Saxon like analytic philosophy. Right, and it would be nice to bring it back in history of quantum. So one little anecdote, since you were like playing with the language, which I think like helps the case. Is so in the beginning of the schematism chapter in the Critique of Pure Reason, there is a sentence where Kant writes like, it's the same circle that I think when I look at a round plate that I see when I imagine a circle. Okay, and so in the standard like Kemp Smith translation of the Critique, it says, well, that he obviously meant it the other way around. It's I see the plate and I think the circle. But if you think that, you don't understand Kant. So like Peyton, the commentator, says, no, that's just wrong on the commentator part, right? And I think this think and see, right, is very nicely ties in with your way of trying to like, get at what does it mean to be anschaulich, and that at the end of the day, like anschaulich is coupled to, just the totality of your conceptual scheme.
Thank you.
We have 4 more questions, so do you want to respond?
Thank you.
It was not a question, no, it was an addendum.
So please.
Yeah. 5 more minutes.
Okay. I'll
Okay,
try to
so
answer yes, no.
I like your talk. I think it's part of an important scholar tradition, philosophical tradition, which tries to understand Bohr, Heisenberg, and so on, beyond the stereotypes that Bohr was obscure, Heisenberg was positivist, Heisenberg was Platonist, and so on. Now, my small remark is that you spoke Bohr as appealing to classical concepts. You're right, but I think that it's better to be more precise, telling that for Bohr, when you are doing experiments, physicists, as any human being, needs to use plain language, natural language, enriched by concepts from classical physics. I think that this kind of explanation, which is more literal in Bohr's text, avoids the wrong impression that Bohr was preaching the coexistence of classical physics and quantum physics. For Bohr, there was no this kind of divided world.
Thanks a lot. I agree. Yes. I'll try to answer yes and no, so we can get everyone to...
Another question on the relation between Kant, Bohr, and Heisenberg. The correspondence principle, I'm also a philosopher, no? As a background. So the correspondence principle, the early formulation of the correspondence principle seems to be bound to a Kantian-like scheme. No? How do you explain the fact that After 1924, with the crisis of space-time description, the correspondence relation survived the crisis of the space-time description representation with the failure of the PKS theory. Is it clear, the question? Or, in my view, it's better to explain, to describe the matrix mechanics, the new quantum mechanics, in terms of a neo-Kantian or a Cassirian view, for example, in a functional way, you know? And there are many, many gaps. For example, in 1913, Bohr formulated stationary states in terms of concepts, pure concepts, independently of orbits. After 1925, maybe it's possible to recuperate the concept of stationary state. Have you thought about this thing? And for example, another suggestion, if it's in brackets. For example, the concept of entanglement, as was considered by Bohr. 1927, in the paper that anticipated the Como lecture. There, Bohr spoke of, as synonyms, stationary states, quantum postulates, with the same meaning.
Very quickly, I think Bohr's limitation in his view is that he couldn't correctly apprehend how concepts change through time. How would I explain it? I would go to Heisenberg's proposal that the meaning changes with the context and that the same concept changes its reference if the context around it changes. So, for example, energy. The same concept means different things if we're talking about Hamiltonian celestial mechanics or if we're talking about quantum mechanics. And in this view, meaning changes through history, and I think that would be a good explanation of it's not that we have the object and we interact and then we form concepts, is that we have nature, then language, and then we form concepts. That would be my guess.
Okay, then, so we have to close down and
Anything else? No, thank you. Thank you.
let's step away the coffee break, please. And we complete 20 minutes or so, yeah?